production at this moment in time. This is an interview with Don Vaughan. The date is March 14th, 1994, and we're in Vancouver, British Columbia. Hi, Don.
Hi.
Thanks so much for taking time to talk with me today. Maybe we can begin with some basic kinds of biographical questions. Where were you born and when?
I was born down the Oregon coast in a small logging fishing town called Coos Bay, spelled C-O-O-S. Yes, often confused with a Goose Bay, especially during the war when it was a air stopover. So everybody knew about Goose Bay, but nobody had ever heard about our little town, which, like Saanich and a lot of communities here in BC, was named after an Indian tribe.
And when was that?
Oh, that was in 1937.
The date?
June 21st, middle of summer. Or not middle of summer, the beginning of summer.
Yeah, right, the summer solstice, as
Yes.
we were discussing just the other day. And your schooling, you did undergraduate work?
At the University of Oregon.
Is that in Eugene?
That's in Eugene. But prior to that, when I left high school, I went into the Navy for a couple of years. I didn't know what to do. I really did not like academic worlds. And the Navy sounded just fine. So I was in the Orient on an aircraft carrier for 2 years.
Oh.
And during that time, when we were back in San Diego, I ended up finding my way up to the library and started reading about Frank Lloyd Wright for some reason. And my father had been in architecture at the University of Oregon, and my mother had been in interior design in the same school. And so I had some sort of, I guess, inkling that that was an interesting thing, although my dad graduated in 1932, which was sort of a depressed period in the economy, and ended up working as a longshoreman in San Francisco. So he didn't ever practice landscape architecture. Actually, he was in the lumber business. So I didn't really see any of that, and there were no architects in Coos Bay, so I didn't really have any sort of influence in that respect. But I did come back and start off in architecture at the University of Oregon. Took the program. It's a 5-year program. First 2 years, very interestingly, are a general program that includes sculpture, painting, landscape architecture, interior design, planning, and architecture, but generally equal emphasis on all of them as a basic design program. And it was the end of the second year that I had a car accident that put me in the hospital. And I was in the hospital for 4 months with ruptured diaphragm, broken back, etc. It was really pretty bad accident. And when I came out, of course, it was now partway into the first term of the next year. And one of my professors that I'd had was a landscape architect, and he had come by to visit me. And he felt that I still, even though I'd been 2 years in the Navy, wasn't ready to settle down, and that I shouldn't come back into the program right away, but go work for a year, being that I already interrupted it, and come back in the following September in time for a full program. And so I went off to Australia and worked for a year in Melbourne. And when I came back, one of the interesting things while I was there is there was an architectural firm of about 50 people called Buchan, Laird and Buchan. They were doing a lot of buildings in Canberra. And this professor that I had, his name was Mac Ruff, had worked there previously. He had taken a sabbatical and had worked over with this firm. And so they had a lot of respect for the role of the University of Oregon as a very broad planning, landscape architecture program. So the fact that I came in with only 2 years of architecture and no other background didn't matter. And as we were talking about earlier, how people judge individuals by the schools they go to, the fact that I went to Oregon, I must know about landscape architecture. So therefore, they had me out doing this sort of site planning. They were doing a number of major projects in the countryside. And I went out to with the senior architect to help site the buildings and deal with the parking and this sort of thing. And I found this really quite powerful, that it didn't matter what the building looked like. I was going to be able to say how it fit on the site, what topography was going to be changed. And I felt this was really far more exciting than the architecture. And in the firm doing Canberra buildings, which were government buildings, these buildings had been in the office for 4 or 5 years. And the one I was working on had been in the office for over 2 years. And when I left, it wasn't any closer to complete than it was before. And I was in charge of dealing with door details and relocating these doors as through this time period, people came and went out of the program. So somebody would get a new secretary and he'd need more room, and his room and office would change. So they were continually changing it. I mean, the building design was being renovated as faster than they could even get the drawings done. So I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do. And one of the people in the office had told me quite truly that architects, he believed, had either two roles. Whether they're going to be a marvelous designer working on small projects, or they're going to be in a team, and they're only going to be a little part of a big team doing major buildings, and they will never really feel the gratification in design. So if you want to be a designer, you're going to have to resign yourself back. It's going to be small residences and things like that. That didn't appeal to me. So when I got back to Oregon, I decided to go into landscape architecture. And that's, I mean, I only heard about it through the school, and that's how I ended up in it. And never regretted that for a moment. It was really quite exciting. I liked the design programs. I liked the idea that we were dealing with major projects and things like that. One of the things that concerned me while I was there, though, is I began to realize that when I was in the office in Australia, we were dealing with actually the sort of environment, because it's so harsh. I mean, that the idea that the eucalyptus trees keep the grass growing because they collect the humidity out of the air, and on these are waxy leaves that drops droplets to the ground that would otherwise be a parched landscape, was known to everybody down there. They understood that. But when I came back, I found that here, you know, you log the forest, and I'm not talking about here, Vancouver, but I mean here, everywhere, the United States and Canada. And there wasn't a sensitivity to the environment. And so I wanted to take some courses in environment and sort of planning. And it was very strange that when I asked the department head about this, if there wasn't something we could sort of structure into it, he said no, that the school was not going to be involved in that kind of thing. It was a design program, and the emphasis was on design. And the thesis for every student, since he had been head of the department, which was now going on 30 years, his name was Fred Cuthbert, had been a major estate. And the thesis project was required to be that, and it was to deal with irrigation plans, details, planting plans, the whole job. And he said that if you could do that, then you could be a landscape architect. If you can't, you will never be one. And we got sort of over arguments over that, but he thought environmental planning was for another profession, and it wasn't ours. So I went over to the department, the science department, to inquire what kind of courses I could get into. And ironically, to take any courses of significant environment, I had to be a major in sciences. And I had to have a 3-year prerequisite of previous science courses. And the course I would get into was so basic, I read about it. It was, you know, how the plankton become eaten by the fish, and the fish are eaten by the sharks, and the whole system, and numbers and how that all works. And I thought, well, that's not what I want anyway. I do not want a scientific approach to environment. And I got more and more discouraged. I decided to do my thesis contrary to what they wanted. And I was going to do a resort on the Oregon coast, dealing with the fishing industry in Coos Bay and trying to deal with sort of that sort of resort planning that I thought was relevant, and dealing again with a environment which I've, growing up on the Oregon coast, had realized was quite unique, and that it was that seacoast environment. And to deal with that, not dealing with ornamental plants as the program was teaching at the University of Oregon. In fact, our plant material course was, let's walk around the campus and identify the plants, which again, some landscape architect previously had planted that he had purchased at a nursery, and they were everything from Japanese maples that originated in Japan, or ornamental cherries, or heathers from England, but there was nothing identified as this is what our region's about. And I didn't even think much about it at the time, but I did realize that I did want to deal with something that really reinforced regional landscapes. And I started on it and was well into it when I got in a blow up with the head of the department in the middle of one of my presentations in front of the rest of the student body. And I told him I disagreed with his policies and principles and things like this. And so the next day I came back to my desk, and there was a note saying to come see him. So I thought, well, I wasn't surprised. I expected that, and I went in properly humble and said I apologized, and it was just I've been up all night doing my project for the presentation, and I guess I was really out of line, and I really apologized, and was there anything I could do to atone for this? And he said, oh, no, I understand that happens to all students. That isn't why I called you in. I've just been so busy that I hadn't had time to look at your thesis that you're working on. And I just think it's totally inappropriate, and I think you should do a residence. I think it would be very good for you. And I said, thank you, goodbye. I went, packed up my stuff, and left school. And it was, with about 3 months to go. It was kind of stupid time to leave the university, but that was it. And I decided I was going to work for Larry Halprin. Like you earlier said, when should we leave? And I said, we are leaving. Well, that's sort of, I guess, been the way I've dealt with my life. I'm going to go work for Larry Halprin. So I packed up my bags and headed to California. Knocked on the door. Well, didn't knock, went in and said, I'd like to see Larry Halprin. And she said, and who's, shall I say, is calling? And I told her, and she said, is he expecting you? And I said, oh, no, but I'm here because I'd like to work for him. And she found this almost amusing, not shocking, just more amusing. Well, the shock didn't even enter into it. It was, but it turned out that the firm had the worst period in its history of business. California was going through an immense recession at the time, and this had been sort of the early 60s. And they were down to Larry and Vignola and Carter and a few others that were the partners of the company. And so Don Vignola came out to talk to me and said, come on in the conference room and tell me all about yourself and everything else. And about halfway through, he said, by the way, you wouldn't have even been let in the door if we weren't so out of work. But the 5 of us are sitting here with nothing to do. So I'm going to spend the time talking to you, but I'll tell you, we're not going to hire you because we don't even have work for ourselves. So he said, but we have one job in the office, and that's up in Canada. And it's Simon Fraser University. And we're doing this with, University of Victoria. I take that back. It was the University of Victoria. And we're doing this with a fellow who used to work in our office for summers when he was going to Cal, named John Lancius. And John keeps telling me it's hard to find good people in Vancouver. And after talking to you, you want to do sort of major work and you want to be truly hands-on, involved, and not not somebody else telling you what to design. And they told me again at that point, that would have never happened here, Don. Larry does the design. You'd just be a draftsman for a long time. So you wouldn't have wanted to be here. Mm-hmm. But John would like to have you, so give him a call. So I went over to their phone, let me use the phone. I called John, told him where I was, and they suggested I come up, and he said, yeah, come on up. And so the next day I got in the plane, left San Francisco and headed to Vancouver, and next morning I was working in John's office. And John Lancius was sharing space with Arthur Erickson and Jeff Massey and Zoltan Kiss and a few other architects, and Jeff and Arthur had gone together to do the competition for Simon Fraser. And so John was working on that also. And so immediately I was working both on UVic and Simon Fraser. UVic sort of in its new campus, 2 of the buildings, the library and one of the classroom buildings, have been completed. And virtually no landscape had really been done, other than the Student Union building that Clive Justice had done. That Clive had worked with Bob Siddall, who was also the architect in Victoria, doing the library and a number of the buildings. And so Clive had done the library with John de Castry, who was the architect of that building. But other than that, the campus plan really hadn't been done. And it was exactly the kind of thing I wanted to do. It was large-scale planning where landscape architecture is the dominant element. It's the buildings are sort of pieces in a landscape, and they can be quite diverse and still come off quite strongly if the landscape's bold enough. And so the concept for the campus had been developed with Larry Halprin and an architectural planning firm called Worcester, Bernardi and Emmons out of San Francisco, and they'd done University of California and a number of other university planning planning schemes down there. Had dealt with a ring road, which was perfectly circular around a square quadrangle. And the size of the quadrangle was about equivalent to 2 city blocks. It's a panel of lawn with a triple row of trees around it. Library at one end and some academic buildings at the other, and sciences on one side framing the quadrangle, and humanities on the other side. And outside the ring road, there's things such as the residences, the law faculty, the faculty club, some of the other sort of support type of buildings that are there. So I really began to cut my teeth on landscape architecture when I came here working with John. At the end of a year and a half, I was working on a residence at the same time. And John asked me, it was actually a residence down in Seattle for Prentice Bloedel of the Macmillan Bloedel fame. And Prentice had a huge residence. And in fact, actually, I think it's the one that Rich Haig has subsequently done some work on and won some national awards on. But we were to do a gate. So I designed a gate, and I'd never been down to the place, but I designed it, and it was sort of a 20-foot wide gate. And John said it had to be wood, but I put some steel supports in it because you can't really support very easily a gate that swings that wide without it. And I calculated it all out, and I enjoyed that aspect of architecture was the sort of engineering, calculating aspects of trying to deal it with the least materials to cantilever the furthest distance, etc. And so I had this gate that perfectly worked, and I found out a couple of days later the drawing was missing. I asked John where it was, and he said, well, I've sent it off to have an engineer review it. I said, John, it's a simple gate. I mean, I've engineered it already. And John says, yes, but you don't have a degree. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. Doesn't matter what I do. And I had a long talk with John about it, and he said, I'll let you work on Simon Fraser, and you can work on all, UVic and all the projects that ever come through the office. But without a degree, I really don't believe I can send you out to be the front person in our office. And I thought, well, I didn't believe that, but I talked to a few of my architect friends, and they said, well, yeah, Don, if you really want to go anywhere in the profession, you're going to have to eventually get a degree. Now, we had no licensing here or anything else yet. Clive and Phil and John had not yet gone to a point of getting that through the government. And Cornelia and John were Harvard, well, Cornelia is the Harvard equivalent, I guess it is. And CSLA members, and very staunch in a professional way. And Clive and Phil and John were the old timers here that had started BCSLA and in a more friendly way, and organized a sort of about a 10-person, I think, profession. And I'd gone to some of their meetings and found them all quite charming and delightful people, but had never joined because John wasn't a member, so I wasn't a member. But I had begun to realize that John was right, that there was this role that if I was ever going to become significant in the profession, I was going to have to go back and get my degree. So I did. I was married by that time, and Patty was about to have a child. So I went back down to the University of Oregon. And in the meantime, in that sort of year and a half to 2 years that I was gone, the program had changed. A guy named Ron Lovinger had come into the program. And I'm not sure where he came from, but he came from a university that had a very strong environmental planning background. So he had brought that in as a very strong component role. And I'd actually hired a young fellow out of Oregon that had sat in the desk next to me to come work at John's office. His name was Harry Haggard. And he'd come up a year after I had come up, and he had met this Ron Lovinger, and he had his problems with Ron because Ron was a real taskmaster and demanded the most out of you. So I wanted to go back there and just get this degree and get back to work somewhere. So Harry had told me, don't let Ron Lovinger get on your committee because he'll make you do a perfect job and you'll never get out. But it turned out Ron was probably a major influence on me because he was trying to bring the school around to having that. And so now I was really going back to do my thesis, is what it amounted to, a couple of courses that I had walked out of the room on. So I had all my last term's courses to redo. And a couple of them were university programs, like a calculus course I had to finish, and my thesis. And Cuthbert was no longer there now, and so I decided I was going to do a planning problem again. But this time it was sort of a 200-acre site in the Coburg Hills. And the planning study was based on the fact that, Ron was quite helpful in this, of looking at it as what are all the possible uses on the site: housing, agriculture, industry, residential, and don't decide that it's going to be residential because you want it to be. If it's residential, it's because industry and agriculture and other things don't work, and deal with it. How are you going to get water to the site, and how is it going to be infrastructured into the city, and how about commuting and into it, and how big does it have to have an elementary school, because that's how big it has to be, and at what point does it sustain a small shopping complex because you designed a bit of a satellite community. So that's what the study was. And one little piece in the end, the school program decided, well, wait, Don, you have to have some landscape architecture in this. So I picked the park. There was a major ravine park, which was an area I was keeping because it was so beautiful with its rocky hills, sort of rock exposures coming down to a marsh. So what I was doing was reinforcing the marsh and making it sort of cohabitable with people, but to try and still deal with it in a very natural way. And therefore it didn't need irrigation and things like this. And it sort of pressed the limits a little bit from the program, that could they really call this a thesis for landscape architecture? But they did, and they gave me my degree, and I came back up. Well, in the meantime, I didn't think I'd come back to Canada. I'd had 2 years here, and that was experience like Australia. But how are we doing on time? I thought you have only asked one question so far.
I don't need to ask me. I'll interrupt you. You get off.
Okay. Yeah, we're sort of scooting through these questions in a less question and answer way. But I had thought I would go on to work probably in California now or somewhere like that. But John Lancius came down, and he came by the university and joined Patty and I for dinner one night, and suggested I come back and sort of take over running the office in Vancouver when I came back. And I said, quite exciting. Why was he thinking that? Well, he was going to take a year off and travel with his family in Europe. And so I said, okay, well, fine. Well, I came back, and there was a secretary there, and that's it. Done. John's left already. He didn't tell me when he was leaving. Just come on up here, and we'll have you'll run the office, and we'll talk about it when you get here. Well, he decided to leave early, and so I said, well, what am I supposed to? What's going on here? Well, John's just worried that there'll be nobody here while he was away, and it turned out he really was looking for somebody to babysit the office. So if there's a phone call, somebody could go out to look at a site, or if the drawing needed to be revised, somebody would be there. And I hadn't realized that until later. That was his intent. My feeling was, oh my God, so we're out of work. I better get busy. That's my job. So I went out and saw all the architects I knew, Erickson, and we were above Erickson's office. And we had moved since then to an office that Erickson Massey had in an old Royal Bank building, which was a 3-story building. We were on the top floor, and they had the 2 lower floors. And so, in fact, actually, Simon Fraser was still going on at this time. They were into sort of another phase, and so I was working directly with. No, it wasn't. We would already moved before I left the first time, so we were working on that back just before I left. But I went out and saw Erickson's office and talked to them, and Leo Drasser and TB&P and all the people I knew that I'd worked with. In an interesting way, they were sort of junior architects when I first came to town, and now this is 3.5 years later. And these are sort of associates that are in charge of some projects. So when I'm seeing these friends that we sort of drank beer with, is now they're making decisions and hiring the consultants. And so the next thing you know, I was working on a number of projects and bringing them in. And one of the major projects, well, that came a little bit later. But though John came back, he then decided that after about 6 months, that he was going to teach at Ball State University. So he again scooted off with his family, leaving me with the office. And we had by that time, no, we hadn't. We were just about to move, but we moved out of, Erickson needed the whole space. So we had moved out into an old auto body shop that John bought and turned it into an office. And so in working there, I began to get additional work, and there was one job in Seattle, which was called 6001, because that was his address. And it had a 10-acre man-made lake and everything else. The developer had bought this, and Seattle was in major expansion because of Boeing expanding. And they had this, well, there were two banking people that were the developers, and they came from the East Coast, and they were going to put this sort of mega project together, which was strictly housing, but they had intended to take this marsh that was in there, make it into a man-made 10-acre lake with a plastic liner, etc. A workout community facility. This is going to be for rental housing. Closed circuit TV, dining rooms, meeting rooms, gatehouse was sort of a little bit of interest for Seattle. And we were hired as the landscape architects. In fact, the two partners who came up to Vancouver, and they talked to one of the developers in town and said, we're looking for a landscape architect recommendations, and they suggested coming to us. And so I said, sure, great, well, sounds good. When do we come down? Well, there were three firms that we're looking at. Ourselves, a Seattle firm, and Larry Halpern out of San Francisco. So our paths crossed again. And what they liked about our firm was that we were small, and they were going to get personal service from us. And they felt that the landscape architecture in BC was far more exciting than that being done by Seattle landscape architects. And one of the problems in Seattle was that people like Halpern and Tommy Church and everyone else, Royston, had all done most of the major landscapes in Seattle over the years. Rich Haig was the only sort of contender, and he was teaching part-time or most of the time and did mostly park-type work. So this role for landscape architects had not been explored very heavily in Seattle. And so they hired us, and I went down and we started working on it. And during one of the breaks, John came out, and we found our office overwhelmed with work because I'd had to hire more people. And we were buzzing away doing projects in Seattle and all over the place. And he sort of almost freaked out and said, Don, I didn't hire you to do this. I want you just to keep the office nice and small and just take care of things. And John financially doesn't need to be a landscape architect. So he just didn't want to get in trouble. Now I had created a major sort of risk for him, that we were now a major firm doing major work that had man-made lakes and everything else that he would lay awake night worrying about. And I think he continued to lay awake nights worrying about it. And then shortly after that, recession hit Seattle, which sort of just about the time the project was complete, stopped it. It was going to be a two-phase project, but that wasn't a problem. But it also hit us in Vancouver even worse, and all of our work dropped off. And at that time, John, still being at Ball State, wanted to, it was meeting with a young fellow in Winnipeg, who I had never heard of, but most of the Canadians had. His name was Cameron Mann. Young fellow Cameron. And, yes, and Cameron had some younger fellows working with him, Jim Taylor and Claude Murray. And so John called me up one day and said, Don, come to Chicago. I'm meeting with this fellow named Cameron Mann, and we're going to merge with them to create a Canada-wide office. Well, I hadn't realized it, but Cam had been out to Vancouver several times and had come in our office wanting to meet me. And every time I was out on a site somewhere, and so we had never met, and he had never left his name. If he had, I didn't call him back, that's for sure. And so I'm sure he didn't. I'm sure he said, well, just tell the cameraman came to town. Next time I'm in town, I'll look him up again. And we never did meet. So I flew into Chicago. We had a 2-day meeting, talked about how the firm could be merged and what their firm was and what our firm was and what work we were doing, etc.
Where was that in Chicago? Do you remember?
What hotel? Yeah. The Palliser? Is that the big old hotel?
The Hilton.
You may be called the Hilton now. It was...
because Cameron was there last year, and he said, this is where Lombard North was founded. And I thought that he meant like this very hotel. But
it probably was, yeah. But it probably wasn't this meeting. But that was probably whatever hotel he would have stayed in. It was a big old hotel. Yeah. Sort of like our Empress or Vancouver Hotel or something, yeah. And but Lombard North, well, I don't know. Ask Jim Taylor whether that's where it was founded. I don't know.
Okay.
That's another story, and they know it better than me. So I was to go to Winnipeg in a couple of weeks, and we set this thing up. So in the elevator on the way down with John, sort of, I guess we were going to dinner before I headed off back to Vancouver. I said, well, what's my role in the company? I mean, you want me to negotiate this for you? I mean, what is our company, John? I mean, it's you in Ball State, Indiana. I mean, it's a limited company. I mean, I don't know what you're trying to merge or what you're trying to do. And he says, oh, no, Don, you and I are 50-50 partners. And that's what the company is. Well, there was no written agreement, but before you start a new company, you have to know what is your old company. So
whence do we come?
That's right. So I showed up in Winnipeg with the sort of company pro forma and a letter and some statements of what I thought we wanted in Vancouver. And of course, this caught Jim Taylor more by surprise because he didn't want the interview anyway, or the merger anyway. And he says, you look down there, my mind goes to interview and tapes and time on them.
I'm just wondering how come we're not getting any red lights, but that's okay.
Well, you want to stop and test it?
No, that's okay.
And red lights happen when it's bad or good?
Good. Red lights are good in this case. Keep going.
Okay. If it doesn't work, we'll do it another day.
Yes.
So Jim didn't really want the merger. He didn't think they needed it. Cameron wanted it, but it was partly because Cam wanted to be out in BC because his wife wanted to be out here, I gather. And he, wanted, and he and Claude Murray didn't get along, and they were in the Calgary office. Jim was in the, they were in the Winnipeg office. Jim was in the Calgary office. And Claude wanted the merger because it would get Cam out of the office. So they all had their motives, and one of them was just not necessarily worrying about Vancouver. And they thought, well, Cameron thought he was getting a partner that was a silent partner in Winnipeg. I mean, in Ball State, Indiana, and wouldn't ever have to deal with him. He was coming out to run a firm, and there was a draftsman named Don Vaughan he'd have to work with. And when I came suggesting that John and I were partners, and this was a 20% split 5 ways, they sort of freaked out when they weren't even sure that it was a 4-way split equally.
Mm-hmm.
And so we sat down and started negotiating. And it was a pretty tough negotiation. They really weren't sure that that's what they wanted to do. It was sort of surprises that Cameron had not told them about, and John hadn't told Cameron everything either. Yes. Is it 1:30?
Almost about 20 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. Anyway, we did merge, and it was an interesting thing. John and I were partners, but in the company was a 25% shareholder. So virtually they were saying, okay, well, they'll take John on as a partner. So there's 4 partners. And if John wants to be a 50-50 partner with me, that's his business. Mm. And so my agreement with John was that if I ever left the company, I gave him my shares because he was giving them to me, not selling them to me. And Cameron came out, and I could understand very easily why Claude couldn't get along with him. His need for your bureaucracy and formality and triplicate letters would make Phil Tattersfield or anyone else look like a very casual operator. And he had gone by already. And the reason he tried out for several years to open an office out here and had not got a single job. And so he proceeded to go around, now that he was part of our company, which was called Mann Taylor Murray Lancius, not Lombard North yet, mm-hmm. and alienate almost all my clients. So I was having a real problem with clients calling me saying, keep that man out of our office. And I was trying to tell him this politely, and he was getting more upset with me on the fact that he thought I was causing the problem. And we lost virtually all of our work shortly after Cam came. I mean, he had alienated everybody. I could not get anybody to give us work because Cam was the senior partner to me and wanted to be involved in every project. And when they found this out, they were just saying, forget it, Don, we'll work with somebody else. So it pretty soon got to a point where this was stupid, that we were not going to survive. We had 3 partners, John, myself, and Cameron, trying to take a salary out of one office when the other two offices only have one partner each. With what Cam was doing out here destroying the clients, and he wouldn't ever believe it, and he still won't believe it till this day. He'd probably say, I destroyed them, I don't know. The thing was, we were just going bankrupt in Vancouver, and Jim Taylor was happy to take what was a very successful firm in Calgary and take the profits to pay for the losses in Vancouver. It just caused a horrible problem. So one day we were to have, the finances were getting worse and worse, and one day we were to have a meeting in Claude and gang will probably say, John, that was all confidential. You don't tell the dirty laundry. But in the profession, I think that if it was all, that we were all perfect gentlemen and everything, it would have been a very boring profession. But we were to have one of our quarterly meetings. I mean, coming to Vancouver this time. And Claude called and said, no, we're canceling the meeting. We just can't afford these trips with sending everybody out there. There's no need, there's no work and everything else. And I said, well, there was an important part on the agenda I was going to bring up. And I guess maybe I should just bring it up here on the phone. And that is that either Cam goes or I go. And Cam's on the other phone. This is a conference call. He didn't know it either. And Claude said, well, I think that can be worked out. I don't think that we need to jump to any conclusions like that. And Cameron made some comment to the fact that if that's how Don feels, I think we should discuss it and get this out in the open. Well, Cam didn't want me around. He thought I was causing problems. So we had a meeting. I don't know if it was in Vancouver or whether it was wherever it was. But and I know it wasn't in Vancouver. I think it was back in Winnipeg, but I couldn't say for sure. But I did resign. Yes, it was. And I had called John to ask him how he felt about it. And I said, look, things aren't working out between Cam and myself. Our philosophies are different. Vancouver's different. He thinks it's Winnipeg, and that he's going to make our architects that are our major clients do it Winnipeg style, and they aren't up to that and not about to change their way of working just for Cameron. How about your feeling on this, John? And he said, well, I really, quite honestly, have more confidence in Cam than I do in you, Don. So if you want my feeling on it, I have no problem. If you want to leave, that's not going to cause any bitter feelings amongst us. So I said, well, that's fine. That's great. So, I mean, I knew that my loyalty was to John. And if John felt that he'd rather have Cameron, well, he was giving me the blessing to step out and leave him, feed him to the shark. And so I left. It was interesting. Cameron thought I was leaving because I had a big job in my pocket somewhere. And the fact was, it was quite honestly, I was leaving because it just wasn't good for us. It wasn't good for the company. It wasn't good for the staff. It wasn't getting us any work. That maybe if Cameron ran the company his way on his kind of work, they may set up a good firm that would do great work in BC, but it wasn't going to work with me. And so the firm then became, about the same time, it became Lombard North. And it was the four of them plus Pellick and a few other people that were involved. Did you meet Pellick? You didn't interview him. That'd be an interesting interview. Anyway, that was the firm. And it was sort of loosely structured before that, but it didn't have a name. So I always like to think I was part of Lombard North, but I really never was. And Doug had stayed with it, and he was sort of a very important part of Lombard North in Winnipeg. And Cameron shortly left the company and went to teach in California, leaving John again sitting there with nothing. And so John just dropped out of it too. So Lombard North ended up without a Vancouver office and became back to Winnipeg, Calgary, and then they opened a Victoria office later. But anyway, Cam and I have seen each other. We always were friends, and I have the greatest respect. In fact, I was called by somebody back when they were trying to find the head of the department for Guelph, and Cam was on the list. And whoever, Janasic or whoever called me, said, Don, we were told that before we hire Cam, that and we've heard this from a number of people, that we should talk to you first. I said, well, that's fine. Why? What do you want to know? Well, would Cam make a good head of the school? I said, that's exactly what he should do. He's absolutely fantastic at working with students and
running things in a organized way, you're never going to get a better person than Cam. Just I can't work with him doesn't mean he wouldn't make a great head of the program. And I do have that respect for him. He's really a very brilliant man, and his mind is something I would never be able to achieve. I mean, he can read a book and he can recite the book to you almost page for page. One day we were doing something with a golf course, and I asked Cam about something, and he started just telling me the whole thing, and this hole should be this, and this is what you should do, and this. I thought, well, where does he know all these things? I mean, then he said, and there's a book you should read. He told me the book, and he told me the pages, and go read it. And here's exactly what he told me on these pages of a book. I mean, how can you remember the page numbers on the book? But that's what you need if you're going to be head of a school program. That's what students come for you. Where will I find this material? And he would always know. So anyway, Cam and I have respect for him. It's just we couldn't work together. And after that, Claude Murray, who was one of the partners, left the company. He's out here in Victoria. And Claude and I worked together on a number of jobs. In fact, we made a proposal last week to do a major job in Vancouver, but we didn't get even on the short list. But well, no problem. Fee was $450,000. Although people on the short list have that size of fee too, but they probably won't get it either in the end. But we worked together on Expo. Anyway, that sort of takes me up to the time I set up my company, and being we are running late, we might start again with what I did when I started my company and how it went from there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we're happening. Okay, this is a continuation of the interview with Don Vaughan. The date is March 17th, 1994, and we're in Victoria. Hi, Don.
Hi.
Thanks for taking time again to talk with me. When we finished off the other day, you had basically gone through the history of your development up to the point where you were about to work on forming your own company. Would you like to continue things from there?
Sure. As I said, I rambled a bit, and I'll try and be more succinct. Well, I started my own company more just out of the frustration of trying to deal with the business of a bigger firm. When I began to realize that we had 5 partners and trying to communicate to each other and trying to run a company, and the business of the company was eating up any profits that ever would be made, I began to realize that that wasn't the kind of thing I wanted to do, and that I really wanted to be the designer in my own firm and not the sort of manager and partner and these sort of things. So I left, and as I was saying before, Cameron was certain there was some jobs there. Well, there wasn't. The first year was extremely lean. I think I had 2 jobs. The first one was a residence that the client refused to ever pay me on, and the second was a small sort of little shopping center job that I probably got $100 for. So I don't know how I even survived, but we did. And then one of the architects I'd worked on with before came to me with the opportunity to work on what was going to be called Robson Square. And this was back with the NDP, with the Socraig government. And they had hired Thompson, Burke and Pratt and McCarter Nairn as 2 architectural firms to work on it. And I had been asked to be the landscape architect. And this was probably the largest job ever to be given to anybody in Vancouver. And it was a 3-block area, but it was going to have a 50-story tower at one end of it. And the architects were a little nervous bringing me into this as a one-man firm, just starting out on my own. So they asked me to go into the project in a partnership with Larry Halperin's firm, or in a consortium, or which shouldn't be a partnership, but a joint effort, I should say. And so again, Larry and I met, and we worked together to try to deal with the design. And Paul Merrick was the architect in charge for Thompson, Burke and Pratt, and Blair McDonald was the architect in charge for McCarter and Nairn. And it was a very interesting thing, and very well-known architect, Ron Tom, came out, and he was also involved. He was originally with Thompson, Burke and Pratt. He was sort of brought on as a member of the team, sort of in a special way. And Ron and Larry Halpern instantly had bitter problems. Ron did not like having an American brought in from the States to work on it. We found this very offensive. And Ron, as those who know him, had a ability to consume quite a bit of alcohol. And he usually started well before lunch. So by lunchtime, he was aggressive. And so finally, after the second occasion of this at lunch, Larry Halpern just upped and left and got on a plane for San Francisco and never got involved in the project again. A few months later, we had an election, and the NDP with Dave Barrett took over the government, and we were all fired. And the project still went ahead, but they then got Arthur Erickson. And this was, well, by the time they got the project again, it was almost 10 years later that the thing started up again. And so Arthur and I had worked together on Simon Fraser and a few other things. After this project stopped, and before Arthur was the architect for the new Robson Square, Arthur and I had worked together on the Museum of Man. And probably if there's anybody in my life that's influenced me, other than influences of teachers and things in school, the most dramatic influence was with Arthur Erickson. And it started back when I was with John working on Simon Fraser and projects like that, where Arthur sort of, his firm was small, ours was extremely small. We worked very, very closely together. And Arthur's interest in the landscape being an inherent and integral part of the building concept gave me a unique opportunity to work with him. And what he brought to my understanding that I really hadn't ever totally understood, and it reminds me a little bit like when I wanted to learn to fly an airplane. I took some flying lessons. And the first instructor, after about 4 or 5 times up in the air, decided he was going to have somebody else teach me, because I just wasn't getting this. I mean, I was jerking this plane around rather erratically. And the other pilot, we took off and I got in the air, and he said, well, your problem is you're trying to steer the plane. Just let go and see what happens. And great, here we're up in the air, and, I don't want to fall to earth, and, I just let go. And so I did, and the plane flew. And I'm sure that my profs at school had talked about concepts, but somehow they had no meaning, or the idea didn't get across to me that the design process, as I had always thought of it, was a sort of problem-solving process where you studied the problem and you came up with solutions. And these solutions were called design, and they were creative, and they had form, and they had other aspects. This form was borrowed from previous experiences and ways of learning. And Arthur brought to my consciousness that you didn't start there, that you really started with the idea, and that you, as a designer, that was what you brought uniquely to it, was the perception of a concept. And on Simon Fraser, he explained it as the monastery on the hill. And he talked about Mexican ziggurats and things of this nature, and talked about the idea of the form to be based on that. And with that in mind, everything had to reinforce that. So the landscape began to become the sort of clearing at the top of the mountain rather than a vegetated element, because it was to reflect this feeling of height of the monastery, of the isolation. And the design of the entire severity of the buildings and the form tended to borrow on that same sort of thing. And the architecture, as it stepped into the landscape, sort of became architectural landscape, and then natural landscape, and then the forest itself. So there was this sort of overall concept, and then layers of ideas that laid inside it to reinforce it. And this is the first time I'd ever really realized that this aspect of dealing with a design didn't come with solving the problems, but they came with, first of all, you as an individual bringing an idea forward. And so we were working on, after I had left and started my firm, he had contacted me to work on the Museum of Man with him. And this was quite, I was quite pleased he had done that. And we ended up, before he ever did anything, he said, Don, come on out to the site with me.
And so we went out and spent a sort of 3 or 4 hours out on the site, walked it, sat and talked about the views, talked about the place. Arthur hadn't any idea at this point what he was going to do. It was just a new appointment. And Ron Bain from his office had sort of come along, and I think it was Ron. It could have been someone else, but that was my recollection. And was sort of taking notes. And Arthur and I sort of walked along talking about, the Indians and the nature of the village and the building. And he was really using me more as a sounding board. He wasn't asking my advice. That was not his style. And there was these big blister shields which were over the old gun turrets, because this was a place where the guns were protecting the harbor during the Second World War. And so these things were we went inside them and everything. They were so well built that it would cost almost the entire budget just try and remove them. And as we sat there on top of one of these looking out over the water, he began to formulate his concept for the place. And it was the Indian village. And it was, as we looked up how sound, the idea that he was going to bring the water up onto the top and take the water as a reflective element, which he had done on some private swimming pools and things before, where the water just spilled over the edge, so you didn't see an edge, that the water reflective surface merged with the water in the distance, and they appeared to be all at the same level. And he was curious of which trees we could remove and how we could create the appearance of islands, and that you could see up how sound additional islands. And so we worked on that idea in the gravel beach, and he had formulated that right there, and it was quite exciting being part of it. But as the project progressed and was getting near to going under construction, he had decided that he knew what kind of plants should be on there. And he wanted to use some wild grasses and some arbutus and things like this that would just be over the roof and make it very natural. And I tried to explain to him that the grasses would work in the shallow soil, but because of the cost and the loading and all the things that we got into, we only had about 6 inches of soil, and most plants would not grow. Native plants wouldn't grow there. If we would have to irrigate to get most plants to grow there. And if we irrigated, we would get a whole different plant material type than if we tried to make a natural ones, that the irrigation is not natural to the native plants that he'd have on a roof like that. And we got into a bit of a debate, and again, this was out on the site. And I sort of told Arthur that, well, if he wanted to have somebody that just did what he told, that he should hire staff, that when he hires consultants, that he should listen to them. And that's probably the only time I ever really spoke back to Arthur, because that wasn't very wise. So I got a call the next day from the secretary saying, Don, Arthur's going to take your advice. And I said, good. The advice is, you're fired, we're hiring staff. And I found that most amusing. I was sort of really, I said it sincerely. I meant it, Arthur. If you don't want to listen to me, I've learned from you, you're my mentor, but now it's time for me to move on, because I'm not going to just also be your draftsman. And Arthur, true to character, only wanted draftsmen. So, Don, I don't need consultants. So he hired several staff people. Stephen Cripps was one, and one of the fellows that's downstairs now, and I can't, Jerry Eckford was the other. Stephen left, Jerry came. I mean, it was sort of a transition. But he began to realize he really did want a official stamp. He wanted somebody in the end as a landscape architect to stamp the drawings. And Cornelia her kids were now grown up, and she was getting back into the idea of she would like to be involved in landscape architecture of BC. And without any doubt, working with somebody like Arthur would be quite exciting. And so they've had a sort of working relationship when mine stopped that was sort of, Arthur doesn't like changing consultants a lot, so now Cornelia is the landscape architect for him. Interesting thing happened is he didn't tell her about the loading problem, and she didn't ask. She's a landscape plants type person. So she had got her contractors, and she instructed them to bring on this perfect soil and to do everything absolutely perfectly, and brought the plants on and everything else. And because of the timing, they were doing this on a weekend. Monday morning, the contractors came, and some of the doors wouldn't open. And they called Arthur, and his office sent somebody out, and they realized, yes, there had been a settlement in the building over the weekend. And this was strange until somebody realized the landscaping went on the weekend. And they went up and found that Cornelia had instructed them to put 18 inches of soil on there because the kind of plants Arthur wanted had to have that much soil. So she'll do everything he says, but she doesn't ever question him. So they had to strip everything off, and the doors opened again. And then I don't know what got planted on there, mostly grasses. And the university's not been happy with it. But anyway, that's how my office career started. And it started with me just working out of the house in North Vancouver, a little room that was sort of 10 by 10. And then, as some of this work began to happen, I had to bring on some staff. And there really weren't, there was school back east in Guelph. No one came out west. They didn't need to. Things were buoyant in Ontario. Why go out across the Rockies to this frontier where no one probably even knew how to speak English? Well, I don't even think most of them knew it existed. But the point was that there was a lot of fine offices, Dick Strong's office and others that were doing exciting things. So the interest to come out west just wasn't here. And Ryerson, we couldn't get anybody to come out from Ryerson, still can't, because the interest, there has always been enough demand in the East Coast for the landscape architects graduating from the programs. So I went down to my old alma mater, or at University of Oregon, called Macroff, the professor that had sent me into landscape architecture, told him I was going to come down. First of all, I asked him to send me some people. Send me one of your best students. I need somebody immediately. And or at the end of the term, it was coming to the end of the term and the end of the school year. And so whoever was going to be graduating, I just need somebody. He says, no, I'm not going to let you off that easy. My course I'm teaching is business practice. So I'm going to have them prepare for an interview. So every one of my students, you're going to have to come down, and everyone's going to have to prepare as though he's going to look for a job. And the winner, they're going to do a good job because this is better than an A. One of them's going to get a job. And jobs were really quite hard to get in Oregon at that time. So they were all really quite interested.
This was what year?
Oh, this was 74.
Okay.
I went down, and actually in the end they all didn't want to even go in with this. Mac had said, you have to. Well, some of them said, look, I'm going to go work for the government, or I've got this job, or I'm not doing this yet, I want to travel, or a number of reasons. So there was only about 8, I think, that prepared for this interview. And I hired one, Jeff Phillips, and actually I wanted to hire 2, but I couldn't afford to hire 2. 2 were very excellent. But I hired Jeff, and he came up to work for me, and we got busy enough within a month or two. Bob Hostler was still around looking for a job. I called Bob, and he said yes, he'd love to come up, and so he came on up. Bob now works back in Ottawa somewhere. So the firm started with Jeff and Bob. Then very shortly after that, I still needed more people, and so Jane Durante came to work for me as a draftsman. And then Ken McKillop came and joined me from BCIT, who had a building and technology background, which was spec writing and contract management and things like this. So we had quite a interesting little firm, and we had opened an office down where now the C-Bus is in North Vancouver. It was on the waterfront, in front of some industrial lands at the time. It was the old Storks Workspor, which was an engine company, Swedish engine company that put engines in most of the big tugboats in the harbor. And they had the ground floor and the basement floor underneath that. We had a little office up above. And then we moved to the city. And that was about the time several other people had joined us, Dick Pavlik. Well, that's an interesting story. I then decided I needed more people. And so I called down again to the university and said, I need some people. This time I was talking to Ron Lovinger, who I mentioned earlier, had been one of the profs down there teaching environmental planning and things. I think Mac was on a sabbatical in New Guinea by then. So Ron, again, had a deal. Wasn't nobody letting me off easy. I'll bring up some people down. I'm not going to send you up anybody, but I'm going to bring up 5 people. And you're going to pay for their travel and hotel room, and you're going to throw us a party, And Ron was less. Mac was concerned about his students. Ron was concerned about a good time. So this was a good time. And he suggested things had now gotten busy. It was about 2 years later in Oregon, and that it wasn't going to be easy for me to get anybody. So I was really going to have to wine them and dine them. So we put them up in the Bayshore Hotel, and we did wine them and dine them, threw them a big party and everything else. And out of it, there were 2 people that really looked to be good people. In fact, the reality is there was only one of them really even intended to come up here and work. The other 4 came up for the party. So anyway, the one I wanted to have come work for us was Dick Pavlik. And Dick was working for Mitchell MacArthur at the time, and later called Mitchell Nelson, and I think it's now Mitchell Nelson. But he was happy with his job. He didn't want to come to Canada. I mean, the good time just wasn't good enough. And Ron Rule was the other, and Ron's decided, yes, he would come up. And Ron came to work for us. And as I left the invitation open to Dick, if he ever decided to change, let me know. Well, it was a few months later, their firm had some problems. I don't know what they were. He never really explained it, but he just wasn't happy there anymore. And I think it's kind of, when you know there's another opportunity, you see things differently. And he began to look at, is this where I want to be? And began to realize that no, he was there, and if he wanted to move up, that wasn't possible because there were already partners, and he would just never become one of them. And this young new firm growing rapidly and expanding would be the place he wanted to go. So he joined us in Vancouver. And at that point, we moved into the city, and we bought a house on Hamilton Street, which is sort of now center of the city. And that was our office. And it grew a bit, and a few more people joined us, Steve Sinclair and several others, just other people came. And we did a lot of planning work. We did start doing environmental planning studies for the city of North Vancouver, and the district, I should say, of North Vancouver. We looked at Dilworth Mountain and Kelowna for Dayon, and we're doing a number of projects like that. We had been asked to make a proposal on False Creek South, which was the first work to happen in the city's False Creek. And we went in on the proposal. There was about 7 or 8 architectural firms and ourselves that got sort of semi-shortlisted. I got a phone call saying, Don, your firm looks very interesting, but you're a landscape architect. And we want to shortlist to 3 firms to do the job, and you're not an architect, and you're not joined up with one. You're trying to do this as a landscape architect. And I said, I have 2 of the best architects in the city on my team. And they said, we've never heard of them. And one was Bob Hassel, and the other was Norm Hodson. Norm Hodson went on to do Granville Island as his own firm. But at the time, Norm had a desk in the back of our office as just his one-man little firm. And he and I had done the West End mini parks together. And Bob Hassel was an architect that's done a lot of interesting work since, but mostly house architecture. And they just couldn't accept that this unproven team was worth risking it. And I tried to explain to them that, somebody at the door? We were asked to, they said, well, we've got down to 2 firms that are on the short list of 3, but we've got 3 firms that we would like to shortlist on, but we really think that if you would join one of them, whatever one you want, we'll put that on the short list because all 3 are weak in that capacity. And your proposal really is quite interesting. I explained to them that what I was offering them was an alternative to planning. That if I joined an architectural firm, they would have 3 architectural firms providing different but similar proposals, and that they had the opportunity of having a different perspective. They wouldn't buy that, so they said, no, you have to join with an architectural firm. So they gave me the 3 names. All 3 of them I'd worked with before. They were, no, 2, probably there were 4. 3 of them I'd worked with before. The one I hadn't was Waisman, Dewar, Grout. And so I said, well, I'll call Waisman's firm and see if he'll join my firm to make this proposal. And they said, well, Don, there's no way an architect would work for a landscape architect. And I said, and if I work for an architect, then I'm wasting my time because it's going to be his concept and you're getting just a similar concept with a landscape architect providing some sort of landscape-ish information. Well, Al Waisman couldn't believe that any landscape architect would call him with such a proposal of, if you join my firm, you're on the short list. And that was true. If he joined my team as Don Vaughan with Al Weisman, they would be on the short list. And he, more arrogant than anyone else you've interviewed, not all to be nameless, refused. And I said, fine, then neither one of us are going to get it. And he said that, well, that's fine. I just don't think I could believe that I would ever work as an architect to a landscape team. And we didn't get on the list. But two things happened. One is that the next day, Al called me, or when the thing all came out a week or two later, Al called me and he had to have lunch with me. This began to bother him. Who was the most arrogant person he ever met? Because he thought he was. And what did I know that he didn't know? And so we worked together on a lot of projects after that. And Al and I became good friends. The other thing happened is that Doug Sutcliffe, who was working with the city to deal with selecting the three people, went on to organize the Whistler plan. And so this time he decided that he would give it a shot. And in fact, more than that, he brought us on as the sort of overall planners. And then we worked with Eldon Beck out of San Francisco, who had done Vail. And we worked with some architects and we put together the Whistler Village. So it was interesting in taking that attitude that, look, if you can't let us do it the right way, then we shouldn't do it. They're just a waste of time. I mean, you don't need another landscape architect team. Did prove that Whistler took a different approach, that we did look at Whistler and had actually the design of Whistler done before any architects were hired, that the whole town center, along with the fact we actually had engineers hired before architects, because we had designed the parking structures and needed engineers to carry out the engineering, which was going to be the foundations for all the buildings. The architects were hired with envelopes I had designed saying, here's how I want to frame this space. Here's how high your building is. Here's how the roof pitches go. Here's the materials. Now do the building. What happened to me in that respect is a lot of my good friends who were architects got these jobs, but they so resented working under this relationship, again, because it wasn't the kind of way Vancouver was used to working, that they wouldn't hire me for years on any of their jobs, which was no problem at all. But so that's kind of how the firm grew, and got to a point where we were doing the first stage of Expo, and Jane and Dick, and well, no, actually, got to go back there. Before Whistler, one day the young crew that were the associates, Jeff Phillips, Dick Pavlik, Ron Rule, Steve Sinclair, etc., came to me and said they weren't happy with the way the company was running, that we were not growing big enough and fast enough. We had the potential of being national, and we should restructure, and each one of the partners, the associates should become partners and take on roles. And I said, well, I really didn't like the idea of that. I really had left the partnership of Mann Taylor Mary Lancius because I wanted to be involved in the projects. And if we got any bigger, I was just going to be running a company. And they said, well, that's right. What you should be doing is promoting. That's what you do well. We'll do everything else. I said, well, no, that's not my style. But if you guys can come together and come in with a proposal that makes sense, I'll listen to it. And so, and because things weren't getting done in the office anyway, with their arguing over how they thought the company should get done, work, and jobs weren't getting out. So for the next couple of days, they virtually got nothing done while they tried to debate on, and they'd have these little caucus meetings of how they were going. We had two houses by now. We'd not only owned the house we were in, but we rented the old house next door to it. And they were over there. And so noon one day, after a couple of days, they came and said, okay, we're ready to talk to you. So Jeff Phillips said that I've been chosen to be the spokesman. I said, fine, Jeff. And he started telling me what they had decided. And instantly Dick Pavlik said, that isn't what we said. We said this. And Ron Rule said, you're both wrong. This is what I thought we were going to do. And I said, guys, I've just had it. I've just had it. You're all fired. And I fired, how many we had, 12 people or whatever it was. Everybody, staff, the whole works. Just, I've had it. I don't need this kind of thing. You're all gone. And they didn't think I could do that. First of all, I mean, yes, legally I couldn't. You know what I mean? There are laws that protect employees that I didn't know about, and I gather they didn't either. But that wasn't why they didn't think I couldn't handle the work. Well, I had to. I had to handle the work, and what I did was actually Jane and Ken McKillop went to work for IBI, and I sublet some of that work through them, so they continued to work on it. But these guys all went out and opened their own offices, and Dick Pavlik's got an excellent firm in town, and Jeff Phillips has one of the strongest firms in the city. And Stephen Sinclair went back to school and studied architecture, is now practicing architecture. And Rod has his own firm and does quite some interesting work. So it was good for all of them, but I had sort of restructured and started over. And that's when Whistler happened. It was sort of during that time period. And at that point, Kim Perry came to work for me. And Jane had now become sort of a very reliable designer in the firm and became an associate. And it grew a bit and a bit, and finally Jane and Kim became partners, and then Kim went on his own, and Jane sort of, each time Ken McKillop became a partner, and a guy named Jim Jarvis had come in and been a partner. And so each time these people would buy in some shares, when they left, they want to sell their shares, and I did not want to buy the shares back. In fact, my 10-year plan had been that when 50% of the company had been liquidated through bonusing of shares to the associates, and they didn't really buy the shares, they were always bonused the shares, but the shares have value, so they could sell them if they wanted to. My plan was at the end of that time period, I would assess whether I wanted to continue or not continue. And that was when I was going to be 50 years old. Was it a 10-year plan? Oh, yeah. Maybe I was going to be older than that. Anyway, what happened was that the company went into recession in 82, and or this country did, and we suffered badly. And the company got down to just a few of us, and we sort of struggled along. And we finally got back up on top with the first stage of Expo, and made a little bit of money, and we're now not in the red, but in the black again. And we had bought another little condominium shared office. And I had gone off, I started doing some teaching. I'd spend 1 month every other year teaching with the students out of architecture in the Studies Abroad program. The first year was Venice, and the next year was Hong Kong, and the third year was Athens. But after coming back from the second year in Hong Kong, I realized what I'd told the students in Venice was about ideals and about concepts and about beliefs and what they had to offer, and not to be compromised by clients who really wanted something cheap and fast and maybe not consistent with what their beliefs of a better world are. A lot of the kind of things we're hearing down here today. Very easy to stand up and say that it should be a better world, to be moral and believe in spirituality and things. Well, I was saying, I guess, some of the same things. And when it came down to is it not picking up very well?
Oh, no, it's okay. Start with
When it came down to it, I came back and did all these projects, and then went off to Hong Kong. I started telling the students these same things again, and realized that 2 years had gone by since I'd said those. And I went back, and I was really compromising, because there'd been a recession, and I was taking work that I really didn't like taking for fees that were too low on projects that were being done quite nastily just to get them through permits and things like that. And so I felt very uncomfortable when I came back about doing more of this. And Expo had started, but they had only done the preview center, which we had done the design on. They now were going to go into the full development of it. And they had an idea under Dick Strong of how it should be. And they were going to have somebody do an overall sort of master plan for the landscape, and then divide it up in pieces and have different firms do each piece. Well, the concept of Expo was a lineal system. It was Highway 86, so to speak. That was site's name for a piece of sculpture they did it. But that's kind of what it was. It was the monorail with these things like a shopping center hanging onto it. And the concept was exceptional, because it was very much about how people were using their leisure. And as one of the speakers said today, don't create something better than a shopping center for people's leisure time. Well, that is in 86 and still today. That was what people saw leisure time. So if the Expo was designed with that same understanding of how people walk along looking at shops, are entertained in the mall, not in the store, that this is how it would work. And so a lot of this street entertainment and lights and neon and everything was on the street, so to speak, they called it a street, but it was more like a shopping mall, even though it was open. And so I didn't agree with this cutting it up. And I had expressed this a number of times, the way I would do it. And I didn't agree with the fact that they had departmentalized design from construction, from costing. So that if we were going to be doing the design, we would do a design and then we would send it to another department of Expo that would check out and see how our costs came out. They would cost our work. And I said, that isn't the way I work. I mean, I don't design things that are over budget to start with because I control the budget. So if I'm going to do it, that's the way it's going to be. So I got by, and I'm in a cocktail party, had met one of the, well, it wasn't Dick, but it was some of the people that were involved in the project, and said, well, we're going to interview right after the first of the year for the landscape architect. And we've been talking for a long time. I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm in Hong Kong. So, give me a call, but I'll have to fly back from Hong Kong. They said, oh, no, we'll wait. When are you back? And so I was back February 15th. So fine, we'll wait till after you're back. Well, I arrived back sort of on this overnight, all that night flight out of Tokyo that does you in, and came back with immense jet lag and was informed that by Patty that you've got a meeting this morning with Expo. So I met Jane and we went to the meeting, and a little bit to our surprise, they had decided, first of all, that they were going to pair us and Guzzy Perry up, Kim Perry being my old partner, and we were going to do this together. But they had also decided they were going to do it their way, and that was that we would do the design and they would tell us whether it was on budget. And there's nothing worse than to try and confront somebody with jet lag, because he doesn't care. And they also were confronting the same guy who, when he got mad at his staff, fired them all. So, I mean, this guy isn't, Don Vaughan doesn't operate normally. He's weird. So, be careful, because he's not going to buy into that. And I didn't. I just said, this is ridiculous. I mean, you're wasting my time. I don't have time for this kind of nonsense. I'm out of it. And Jane was sitting next to me, and she said, well, Don, I think I'll stay, because I think if you don't want it, maybe the firm still wants to do the job. And I said, fine. I left. So she came back and she said, well, I think we'll go ahead and work with Guzzy Perry and I'll take that on. And I said, well, Jane, it's not going to work. The reason I don't want to work with Expo on this is because they're on a tight time, tight budget. Putting a consortium of two firms together is going to make it difficult unless somebody's in charge, and I don't see in charge written there. It's Dick Strong's in charge. And you're going to end up designing something they like, but it's not going to be on budget. And you're going to end up designing something on budget that they're not going to like, and it's just not going to work. And I'm afraid I will have to let it be known that you took this on and I did not want to be involved, because I think we're going to walk away with looking bad. But that's up to you. So a couple of days later, she said, Don, I've talked to them and I've decided that we won't be involved. So Guzzy Perry started on it. I, in the meantime, realized that I was going to hurt the firm. The firm needed to have work. I could be an idealist if I was on my own, but I couldn't be an idealist if people's families were relying on the company to give them income. So I called Jane out of a meeting across town one morning and said, look, I've laid awake all night thinking about this, but let's just close the firm down. You go on your own and do something. I'm going to do something. I don't know, but I'm hurting the firm. And she said, well, no. And because she had told me shortly before this that she was getting a little tired of the company, and she had a summer home on Salt Spring that she might move off to. And we both struggled through a recession that wears on you pretty badly. But what had happened is the reason she was going on her own was because she saw that she was as close to the top as she was ever going to get, because this guy isn't going to die. And so the fact I was going to give her the company, well, that was different. Well, the company had zero value. I mean, we just barely were out of a recession. The liabilities of maintaining the drawings and everything else was greater than the value of the company. So I said, Jane, look, it's yours. If you want it, you run it. I'm getting out. Very cleverly, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I thought maybe I'd go back to planning to school or something. And we had worked with Paul Freeberg on a downtown project in Vancouver, and he had suggested that he could get me into any graduate program I'd ever want to be into. So if I ever wanted to, give him a call. So I was thinking about those kind of things. And in the meantime, Jane decided very cleverly to make sure Don's gone, because this guy keeps coming back. I'm throwing a retirement party for him. That's right. So she surprise retirement party. Everybody in town now knew Dawn has retired. And even today, which is more than 10 years ago, people will say, "You're still, that's right, you're still working. I thought you retired." So very clever. If you ever get a partner you want to eliminate, you just throw them a retirement party.
Well, that's something Frank Sinatra's done in every time.
Yes, yes. Anyway, so that's then I started. Interestingly, Expo called a couple weeks later. Everybody knew I had retired, and wanted to have dinner with me, and I said sure. I didn't know what they were up to, and it was kept quite quiet that actually Jimmy Patterson had reviewed the design that Guzzy Perry had done, and the costing people had reviewed the design that Guzzy Perry had done for the overall site. It was 50% over budget, I was told, but Jimmy didn't like it anyway. So here was a problem that I predicted would inevitably happen. The thing was falling apart. Now they had lost 2 months. That they were 2 months behind schedule. And instead of having 8 months to do the thing, they had to do it in 6. Get all the working drawings done and tenders in. And what they said to me is, "You said you could do it before. Can you still do it?" And I said, "Well, yeah. What did I say I could do?" And what I had told them is that if I were hired, I would take charge of it as myself. And I would have Jeff Phillips and Dick Pavlik and John Lancius and Cornelia and Art Cowie and other of the top landscape architects in the city as a consortium. And I would have them individually, John and Cornelia for their design sensitivities. People like Jeff Phillips would be working on grading because his abilities to deal with that. Different people on plant material, different people dealing with the technical drawing. So instead of trying to have one firm, I picked the best out of the 50 landscape architects we had in the province. I picked the best, turned out to be 35 people, and form a company that they would have to commit individually themselves to that project. And they were saying, that's what I told them. And they said, "That's what you told us." And I said, "Well, okay." And they said, "Well, can you do that? I mean, we don't believe that you could get these people together to work together when they're competitors. It couldn't happen in Ontario, and I don't think it would happen in BC." And I said I thought that I could. So I called them all, and they all thought this was the greatest party of all, because half of them have been ex-partners or associates. So we rented a floor in the office building above Expo and put a firm together with drafting tables around the place and went to work. And we actually completed the project. There was a hint when we started negotiations that there was a missing ingredient, and it took me a while to sort of unpuzzle the ingredient. It was Maura Quayle's husband, Dave Fitzfushty, who was also involved with Expo at the time. That was sort of the person we were negotiating with. And it turned out through talking to him, the missing ingredient was Claude Murray, a good friend of mine, ex-partner, part of Lombard, and a good friend of theirs. And they felt that as much as I could handle the design and everything, they really wanted that control that Claude had provided to Lombard, that management control that he, like no one in Canada I've ever seen, can do. And with a project like this, they weren't worried that I could satisfy the design and probably the cost, but could I get it done on time? Could I control 35, prima donnas? And so when we finally put that together, that became the TLC, the Landscape Collaborative. And we completed the project about a week or two ahead of schedule, the design work, and it came in slightly under budget, and everybody was happy. And then I went off to art school for 3 years. And then I formed my new company, which is Vaughan Limited, with slowly bringing in both Jeff and Mark, who are my sons, and running a very, very small and very efficient, though, company where I do control the design like I've always wanted to do, and involved in things like Concord Pacific and the overall planning of it, as well as the details of some of the parks. We're doing one of the parks and things like that. Concord Pacific is the Li Ka-shing firm that bought the 200 acres of Expo after the fair. And they put a consortium of Barry Downs or Shambo, I should say, Davidson Ewan and Hulbert Group, 3 architectural firms together, and brought myself in as a landscape architect and Duncan Hay, or Hay and Company, as an engineer, and said, "Okay, you guys come up with a concept that works, and At this point, they hadn't purchased the land yet. It was still this proposal. And there was a proposal being made by Jack Poole of Dayon Corporation, which was what's now VLC. And there was these two proposals, and it was a design as well as cost proposal. And so we had to produce this rather elaborate model with a concept. And again, the concept was strong. It was called Islands and Lagoons. And it was really trying to create islands in the creek and taking the water back into the city. This was an exciting idea, but the city realized after about a year and a half, we did get the project. The government sold the land to LeGeyt. We got the project. My role as a landscape architect was really in a support system because Rick Hulbert was the concept architect. So anyway, in that, the city didn't like the scheme. When it finally came down to us bringing it forward, the city said no, they weren't going to buy into this, that it actually was a great project, but it wasn't a great city. And that what we had ignored is we had created isn't it nice to live on the islands? And what about it if you don't? You're sort of on the wrong side of the tracks. So that if you went out to our parks, you went out to our parks, not the city parks. And the walk around the islands, these waterfront walks we created, were really for the people who lived in this very exclusive island paradise. And so they were really worried that we hadn't integrated with the city. So after Stanley had met with the mayor and with the city manager and a number of people over this process, he began to realize that it just wasn't going to get through. Every time we solved one problem of why they didn't like it, they found another problem. And so Stanley came back into the office and we were all working together on the 4th floor of his building. He said, okay, guys, we've got 2 weeks to do a new scheme. And what I want is to see, what you can do. And so we worked away, and the thing began to deteriorate badly because what they try to do is retrofit the scheme. Let's see how much of it we can hang on to and give the city what they want. And the thing began just to be dreadful. And so anyway, at the end of the 2 weeks, they were making a presentation, and I really, at this point, had virtually walked away from it. It was there more to answer technical questions with this team because I was really losing heart in it. And the presentation was made, and Stanley says, thank you. And I got up and I left. I just really was the presentation just made me mad to listen to it, and made me even madder to see Stanley saying thank you. Stanley saw me get up and leave, but I thought it was generally over, but it wasn't really over. You just don't get up and leave a meeting until after Stanley leaves. And so he came out and he hollered at me down the hall. I said, wait. And he said, where are you going? And I said, well, Stanley, quite honestly, I hate to tell you this, but if that's the scheme you're going with, I'm on to other things that I have no value in this scheme. And he says, what makes you think I'm accepting it? And I said, you smiled and you nodded your head, and I read that as you liked it. And he says, don't ever believe what you see in the expression of a Chinese person's face. He said, you will never know what I think by looking at me, Don. That I guarantee you. Which was a good learning in itself. I learned a lot about Stanley and how I dealt with Stanley and clients after that. But in that, he said, I came back in then, and he said, I don't like the scheme. He told him that. And I don't know whether he'd been that blunt if I hadn't walked out, but he says, I want you to break into 3 teams and come up with 3 proposals and work at it. And so we all said, okay. And I started getting, he said, no, you stay here, Don. You and I are going to do a scheme. I want to see if you don't like that, what would you do? And so we began to talk about the fact that what Rick had done with his islands and lagoons had given a concept so strong that they didn't need to see a drawing. You in your mind, if you know that site, would have an idea of this project just by describing in those little few words of this concept about this project as islands and lagoons. And what you did imagine would be very similar, even though the forms might be different, the concept was clear. So I said, Stanley, we can't lose that. That was the one thing that Rick brought to the project, is a strong concept. So we've got to deal with the concept, but we want to deal with it, first of all, environmentally. We want to keep the shoreline, not fill it up. That was one of the things the city didn't like. And we want to integrate it with the city. And how could we do this? And so we started talking about what was the lagoon about? What was it? If it wasn't islands, which there aren't any, what are there? And what there was a series of bays. But we didn't have a lot of bays. We have one bay. So how were we going to reinforce that as a concept? And we began to realize that if we took those little shallow bays and made them bigger by making them the parks, the flat open space. Because on Granville Island, we had done that. We had actually made Granville Island, which isn't an island by putting a meadow and a playfield in between the housing and what we developed, so that, and we put in a little false lagoon body of water. But what it did was made sort of a tidal isthmus that made it look like an island. And so we took that same idea and created these parks. And then we then took the points that were not much of a peninsula, but made them really peninsulas by putting the dense housing on it, so that it reinforced neighborhoods by having these sort of nodes that were peninsulas and bays, and we call it the bays scheme. And so that scheme was one, and Stein said, so you go work on that, Tom. So I went out and worked on that, and Rick Hulbert took his staff and just went back to his office, just sort of like, you don't like my scheme, well, bugger you. And so left Barry Downs and Davidson Ewan. Well, Davidson Ewan was a little bit like Claude Murray's firm, or when we joined on Expo, they were just managing it. So Davidson Ewan's firm just walked away. So Barry's firm was doing a scheme, Rick Hulbert was doing a scheme, and I was doing a scheme, and I had no staff because their architects were the staff. So I commandeered one of their architects. And this poor young fellow, I've worked with him since, really wasn't too happy because he didn't want to work on a landscape architect's scheme. I mean, this sort of same mentality. And I said, well, trust me, this scheme is the scheme we're going to build. And I didn't say any more. And the next day he was working away, helped me on this. And Stanley came right over to where we were working, looked at it and said, oh, Don, do this. And, oh, hey, I like that, but change this. And okay, and left again. And later in the afternoon, he came down and said, oh, yeah, you worked on that, Don, just right. Okay, fine. Okay, and we'll do this. And hey, why don't we do this? And, scribbled some things. Stanley was an architect as well as president of Concord Pacific. And he left again. And at this point, the young architect realized, yes, you're right, Don. Stanley doesn't care what they're doing. He's already decided which scheme. And it's our scheme. And this kid just got so proud and worked so hard. And when we presented him, it turned out I didn't realize. I thought they were still going to review 3 schemes. Barry's firm had already lost interest in their scheme because they knew it wasn't very strong and it was trying to retrofit. Rick Hulbert didn't know what was happening because they came back from their office with a very, very slick sort of modernist, but postmodern, and some names and games and things that just didn't hold together at all. They lost heart because they had this island scheme and they couldn't shake it. And so when we presented our scheme, it was clear that this is what was going to happen. And that became the Concord Pacific project, which I've been working on very strongly ever since. Anyway, that was the 7 minutes. That was going to be succinct with.
About an hour ago.
Was that how long? And we ran out of another tape.
Not quite, but very quickly I'd like to ask you, since we're just kind of on this flow, what do you think the future holds for landscape architecture? In any kind of, either for yourself personally or for the profession. Is there a particular direction that landscape architecture as a profession can go, or landscape architects individually can?
Well, I think that, again, we didn't hear it this morning, but I think we'll hear it before the conference is over. And we've heard it before. But I think landscape architecture, and again, when some people ask me what I brought to the profession, I say, well, I don't know, maybe the use of native plant material. And everyone says, no, Don, what you brought to the profession in BC was what existed in the States with people, and maybe Dick Strong even in the East, but was the fact that the landscape architect can be the prime consultant of a major planning project and can make direction and has something to offer. And by insisting on it, even to the point of not doing the job unless you do, you've been able to pioneer that level that, okay, if you want to be involved with Don, that's the way it's going to have to be. And by taking that strong stand, we have gained that step. And I think somebody the other day, when I was told that these are the people that are being, your select 20, and I was one of them, and I was very surprised because I'm not a pioneer in the profession, that the Clive Justices and the Dick Strongs and the Brad Johnsons and all the rest are the pioneers, and I really come in after they've paved the way. But I think each one of us brings, if we really are working at it, if we're doing our job, we bring the next level. We're like kids in a generation. I'm a generation later. Why does somebody have to sit there? You go down.
were saying that the people who had affected this whole process.
Yeah, they pioneered the way and made it possible. So, I mean, different people had done different things. I was saying Phil with the legislation, and John Deal with the school, and Clive with getting documentation required for development permits. So landscape architects were being called in on projects early on to deal with them. That pioneering made it possible for me to be as arrogant and demanding of a larger role of planning and environmental sensitivity the landscape architecture brings to that early stage of a project. But it reminded me also, Ian McCarg was out here once and he was giving a lecture, and I was president of BCSLA at the time, and so I was hosting him at a dinner. We were sitting next to each other, and he had come to the lecture, given a lecture when I was at university, and so I didn't make it out to his lecture at UBC when he gave it this time, when he was coming back from Japan and heading back to Pennsylvania. And so I asked one of the people that did go, what did he talk about? And they told me. I thought, yeah, that's the same lecture he gave when I was there. And I thought, well, I knew this about Ian. I'd heard this, that he has this one lecture he always keeps giving. And it's his public lecture. He has student lectures, but he has his public lecture.
Maybe it's really good.
It is a good one. Well, in fact, actually, as you heard today, the speaker, or maybe you weren't there yet, one of the speakers referred to Ian McCarg. And he said, as you all know, Ian has this story he tells. And he went on about the story. Yes, as we all know, Ian gives the same lecture. And so when I was sitting next to Ian, and we were talking just before he was going to make a little speech, and as part of the requirement of being hosted at a dinner, I said, so you gave the same lecture I heard 10 years ago when I was a student. And he says, oh, no, I added a new joke. Didn't you catch it? And which only confirmed, yes, he gave the same lecture. And so I criticized him for that. And he turned to me, and here's, the highest statured person in the profession 15 years ago, all over the world. I mean, this guy had set a new level for landscape architecture, which is, I think, the place it's going to go in the future. And said, when you have done what I have done, then you can ask me to do more. But in the meantime, I have done more than anyone else. And he was right. And what I realized out of that is I began to realize what Clive and Phil had done. They had done all they could do in their experiences. As a child, they were brought up with certain experiences. They took the sieve we were talking about, and this made them possible to give out whatever they could give out. They can't give out something that's not in them. And I realized that what I've done is probably what I can do. And the fact is that I have tried to deal with the idea that what I would really believe the role of a landscape architect to be very powerful in BC today would be to mediate between the forest and the environmentalist, to become the one person, the landscape architect, that understands the land, the politics, the construction technology, the multi-use opportunities, and dealt with that piece of land in its spiritual, economic, environmental way, and said, all these are important, and the landscape architect can pull that off. Now, that person has to have a better background in environmental planning, and better background in business and business understanding of what it takes to make a dollar out of a tree, and better understanding in park planning and multi-use planning. These kind of things are being taught in the universities today. So out of the people coming out of the profession, I hope we'll find the people that are dealing with those huge issues will only be landscape architects. There is nobody else. Until the void is there, until the landscape architects grow strong enough and big enough to fill that void. And that void is not only our forests here in BC that I get concerned about, but there are the farmlands of the Midwest that are depleting their values and erosion and issues. There are the cities and the pollution and the garbage and the rivers and the multi-use of our water systems, and it goes on and on. But ironically, we are the ones somehow back 100 years ago that started being taught how to deal with these. Now, if we as landscape architects don't take on that role in the next 5 years, because that's how little time frame we have, and McCarg's been saying this for 15 years, take on this role, and we haven't yet done it. If we don't,
either the opportunities are going to be gone and it'll be retrofit and then it'll be engineers, or somebody else will. Environmental planners will take on that role, and we, like we have been before, end up being secondary to planners in planning roles. Why not the landscape architect doing Whistler Village? Why a planner? He has no design sensitivities. Why, in the concept for Concord, did it become the owner and the landscape architect who understood the concept? Because they understood the city. The architects understood the building. So we had this marvelous architecture on islands, but that was form. That didn't deal with the social issues of how does a city grow and live and how do people use open space. So those roles that landscape architects have, or that background and knowledge they have, is exactly where we have to go. The difficulty is that schools, it's an interesting thing, are taught by people who have been taught by people. So therefore a school, somebody like Montreal's Peter Jacobs, one of the most articulate, intelligent, capable people I've ever met in my life, can deal with that. But every school doesn't have a Peter Jacobs. And as good as Cameron is, and these people, they aren't Peter. Peter is a visionary, and he sees those things and he articulates them. And even Peter alone can't do it. He needs foresters and political science people and business people to bring a generalist back to being a generalist. We are good because we are generalists. We aren't engineers or hydrologists or geologists or foresters. We see the broad picture. What happened in this broad picture is that I don't think most of us are up to it, that we can't cope. We end up being either, well, in fact, we specialize to the point some firms do residential work. Some firms do universities, and there isn't any difference. That's urban design still. That isn't even beginning to bridge the gap. People like Michael Huff have begun to try and deal with the environment. But Michael's bringing that environmental issue front in a sustainable landscape, and Maura is trying to do the same thing. But there is a economic, political issue that also is there. So where do you find these people that are capable? And when I find somebody like, back when I was young here on the West Coast, I used to think it was Dick Strong. And then I met Dick and met some of his friends and realized, no, Dick had the reputation, but not the ability. And so you think, well, we need people that have that reputation of power, like Halpern and like McCarg and people like this, and have the ability that they do. I mean, I think that in history you have a few Halperns and a few McCargs. Right now, I don't know that we have one, and maybe it's that sort of somebody. Well, it's, I guess, a little bit like me taking on the city, saying no. If I have to join an architect, then forget it. Made them realize, well, maybe we better give Don a chance because he thinks he can do it. Let's see what happens. We need to have some people that at least go out and try to mediate that problem and solve it. But they've got to be powerful enough to convince people that they should be given the chance. And there's such a short time, but I think that's the role. And maybe even if we don't do it fast enough, even if it takes more than the next 6 or 7 years, there's still going to be needs to do it. And that's going to be the role of the landscape architect. And it will be one that we look at now and say, well, still landscape architects deal with the planting plan. I mean, yeah, that's still part of the basis. That's going to become less and less the issue. There are going to be people out there that know the plants because they know the ecosystem, but really don't know one rhododendron from a camellia because it's irrelevant to the ecosystem. So you're going to find that I think maybe we find a role that landscape architects are not going to do irrigation designs or working drawings. In the schools, you haven't yet come to that. They still teach it as, because that's what they learned. And the problem is that, as I say, you teach what you know because that's all you can teach. Who's going to teach them to do what we don't know? And it's like we took computers into our office a year ago. And I thought I'll never use computers. But I realized if I don't, I am going to be, I might as well retire. Jane's prophecy came true. I need to be able to think faster. I need to be able to do faster than I can think. And I need to be store information and have it recoverable instantly. And if I don't, I can't compete. And I need to bring other people's information in graphic form onto my desk and modify it and send it back out in a day or two. And the only way I can do that's with a computer. So we got computers, and within 2 months we traded them in on new computers because they weren't working fast enough for us. And we started doing some projects, and the clients were saying, but Don, we don't want to use a computer. We've got architects doing that, and it is just taking all the time in the world. And they do that. Architects don't know how to use computers. I couldn't believe that. I said, no, I don't know how to use computers, but I know what they can do, and they can speed it up. And we're moving rapidly into it. We have a pen plotter that runs. When we bought it, we thought, well, okay, we bought that 3 months ago. That I wonder if we can really justify it and keep it busy. Well, it now runs till 2 a.m. getting the last drawing out every day, and we're behind schedule on the drawings that need to be plotted. So we're trading it in and getting a $25,000 plotter that can do the drawings in 2 minutes, because that's what's happening. That's what's happening in the world. Who teaches that? I mean, who knows? We're learning it in a year. We've learned more than by being there. Now, that's where it's at, and that's what's happening. And these speakers downstairs, we're talking about spirituality and all these things, and that's terribly important. In this conference, in fact, we're talking about, I hope you looked around the room after you went back in and saw that it is half women.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, and you're saying this is a bit of an unusual situation because that isn't the case. And I said, well, gee, I didn't know it wasn't everywhere because I don't cross the Rockies very often. That's the way it is out here. But the conference also has that tone. If you think about it, and when the gal who closed the thing, Judith Reeves, was talking about, it was gentle and this is nice, and she liked it that way. And we dealt with spirituality, and she said, and where I was sitting, I was watching this little tulip float in the water, this petal that dropped off, and how contemplative it was. What conference have you been to that was the tone? And that's a direction we're going to be going to, is that we're going to become more of the landscape architect that expands both that way, but also we've got to expand into the business, the environment, the rapid changing urban growing world, and how do we deal with it. And as I say, I don't know how. I was saying to Patty a couple of days ago, there was a thing on television about awards to high schools, the 100 best high schools in the United States, and how they were saying about all of the complaints about schools deteriorating in their ability. And this one school they were mentioning that got one of the awards, that you couldn't graduate from this high school unless you're fully literate on a computer. And I said, well, Patty, that's the times. They're changing, that will be the case in a few years with every high school. And the situation is, it's almost kids teaching kids, because they know more, because they are on the machines. I mean, where can you find somebody that knows more than the users these days? It's that rapid a growth that the computer is teaching us to learn by us bringing in the information and learning from it. And it's this huge amount of information that's out there that nobody can assimilate. Nobody can even put together what is there, let alone understand. I mean, it's almost like we're indexing everything rather than understanding it, because there's so much of it, you barely can find out how much information is there, let alone the information that's on it. Mark's computer came up with this thing that looked like a Einstein formula gone berserk with all this writing on it yesterday. I said, Mark, what's that? And he says, oh, that's the computer talking to the other computer, that they don't even use our language. And I mean, he didn't use Mark uses our language. The computers have been taught to communicate through a language we don't know. Now, you almost need these geniuses of the machine, the people who are inventing and creating these programs, to be dealing with the landscape architecture, but they can't, because they're still just dealing with the machinery that we have to learn to use as fast as they're learning to use it, and we have to have an application for it. It's minds we don't have that are going to be existing, because I think our mind can develop that way if it's challenged. But I can't, because my mind's too far developed. So that's what the youth is going to bring forward. I think it's exciting. I think that I find some of my colleagues, contemporaries, find it mind-boggling. In fact, most of them find it mind-boggling that I don't do drawings anymore. After a few months, I only do them on the computer. I shouldn't say I don't do drawings. I do drawings faster and better and more comprehensive, and communicate them to people outside of the office instantaneously. I mean, why bother? I mean, we're doing work here in Victoria. I can draw a drawing. They can send me their building. I can tell them where the problems are, and I can write problems. I can write just like I would in over the drawing board and send it right back to them. And we're communicating that way. And it's just a matter of, no, we probably aren't doing a lot of watercoloring renderings anymore because there just isn't the time. And that's too bad. And Judith's saying, but that's nice to do. And there'll be somebody doing that. So the range is great. The need is more on as much as the healthy environment will be stressed, there's a need not just to be spiritual and understand it, but there's a need for people that are going to have to be very aggressive and go do it. And I see the role being more that, and the urgency being that. I guess maybe I don't. The urgency of what we're talking about is pollution and all this degradation. That's right, you say it. Of the environment is happening so rapidly, it has to be solved too. But how we solve it, I don't know. But I do know that the people that are going to do it are going to have to be the landscape architects, and the engineers will be the people that work for them. Yeah.
You know, one of the things as you're saying that, one of the questions that comes into my mind is, yes, you're absolutely right. The landscape architects who are in the profession now, such as yourself, who are continuing to move through it, there needs to be something happen there. I see it like, for some reason or other, I see a steel wedge that has to get inserted here to make some shifts. And I also see that it has to happen in the schools, that's where there needs to be changes made. But I wonder what that steel wedge is. I wonder what it is that's going to take, what's needed to, you know, like as you said, Peter Jacobs, yes, there's a man who may be able to affect something. But nonetheless, he's still working within a system that takes a tremendous amount of time to respond. That thing is already going in a direction. In order to get that metal wedge in, or that steel wedge, to move that and to shift it, there's a tremendous amount that's required. There's approvals required. There's, you know, curriculum development that's needed. There's all these things that have to happen before that change can be made. What do you have any idea of what that wedge might be? I don't know if that's the right word, but I see.
No, you're exactly right. But the wedge is a person. It's got to be a person. It's just like Ian McHarg and Lawrence Halpern, two people that probably impacted our profession more than anything else. Larry as an urban designer, taking on roles of redesigning cities and streets, and he doesn't do that much anymore in that respect. He's enjoying life and doing beautiful projects that, like myself, said, well, I want to design. But he did change the world that way. And McHarg was saying landscape architects are the environmental planners. We do this sort of overlay system of studying the various systems independently and bring them together. It's only one way of doing it, but he was very strong in doing that. I think that the wedge will have to be sort of the Pied Piper. It will be the person who goes out there and says, follow me. And the majority of the people will be, because they're going to need masses of people educated in this level to fill all the needs, that it's like I've always been concerned about people who over-promote themselves, that they get the job by saying they can do this and then they fail, and it sets things back for worse than if they didn't say they could do it. And so I think that the profession is going to have to develop the backup, and I think that the schools can do. The wedge is going to have to be from an individual. I don't say a group of individuals, but it might be a group simultaneously doing similar things. But people that have that sort of environmental, social, business background, they won't be designers. The designer is a different kind of person. He's sort of an artist that thinks creatively rather than politically and business. I mean, you don't find many artists that are good businessmen, nor do you find many good artists that really are scientists or environmentalists. That there's a different kind of thinking. So I think that, you know, these people that are going to come into this are landscape architects. They'll come into the profession not to learn design. And the schools are going to have to be very tolerant to the fact that if they're coming in to set, and maybe that the role will have to be, schools will have to be so tolerant that students come in, even at undergraduate levels, to set their programs. That this is what I want to do. This is what I want to get. Now tell me, what is it I need to take at this university? What courses? And open the doors and let me take all the courses I think I need to know to get where I want to go. University of Victoria actually allows students to graduate with that basis. that you do not need a program. Absolutely, you have so many credits, and then you graduate, and that's all it needs. There's certain level credits, so many credits of 100, 200, 300, 400 level courses, and then you graduate. And I think schools have to do that, but they have to be able to. And UVic might be where it comes. They've got a tremendous environmental background science program. They got one of the best art schools, theater schools in the country too. So maybe out of that you'll find a school. Although UBC's forestry is one of the best, so you need that too. It could happen at UBC, but it won't. Not with Doug's program, nor Pat's now. It is. They are true traditional people, and of course. The irony is if they weren't, the university wouldn't let them be the head of the school. Somebody that's a radical that would have the ideas I'm talking about, they would be so frightened of this person coming in, they would never let him start. But he's going to discourage our students, and he probably would. Half of them would drop out, but the ones that came in that weren't there would come in and do some things. There was a fellow that was there. He's not there now. He came in about the same time Doug did. I think his name was Pat, but he was on that direction, and he's head of a school somewhere in the States. But those opportunities, if the school doesn't open themselves up to it, just won't happen.
When you were saying that about wanting to take, so this is what I know that I want to do, and here's the courses I think I need to take. Kind of reminded me of somebody who went to the University of Oregon quite a few years ago.
I went to the art school for a summer to see what it was like, and found out that they have two principals that run that school. One is, we are a facility.
Is this the
Emily Carr School of Art. We are a facility at your disposal, and you set your program. So you come in, the faculty are a facility. They're here. You tell us what you want, and set your program, and we are here to help you in every way. We've got a library of slides up here. We've got a wood shop here. We've got welding people. If you want to weld something, this guy over here will show you just how you weld something together. You want to take a course in welding? You can do that too. You want to do a ceramics thing? You want to combine ceramics and steel? Fine, here they are. And I took that one summer course and said, this is where I want to be for a couple of years to pursue art, because it was what I think a school should be. And I think that's very hard for universities because they're mandated to be otherwise. They wouldn't get funding. I mean, art schools can get by with it. Maybe the people the people that are attracted to that kind of program aren't going to be the people that are going to solve our problems. Because they won't be able to talk to the people who make the decisions in a language that will convince them to listen. That you don't talk to the politicians, which are mostly lawyers, or the businesses of logging, or even the environmentalists that are scientists that deal with microbiology or whatever they might, freshwater biology or whatever they're dealing with, as an artist, and say, I have your solution, because none of the three would trust you. They don't even trust each other. So you will have to come in as a scientist with a business background. Somebody that says, I understand that problem, and let me tell you why this makes economic sense. Because if it does, with the debts we have in our country, I mean, one can't be idealist and say the environment's number one, because that's all fine, but when you're bankrupt, you're bankrupt. And so everything, just like with Nixon and over with Reagan, he said that what I'm going to do is create a healthy economy. We're in such trouble, I can't create a healthy environment. And all the things that Johnson had done got thrown out the window. And that is the way, and this was down here today, this one question, the only question that was asked, person said, what are we going to do about our forests? You talk about spiritual. This is our spiritual environment that's being destroyed. How do we deal with that? When the logger says, but I have a family, and that's my priority. I'm saying, yes, this person is going to have to say, I have a solution that is going to put more money in your pocket than if you log. And that's possible. We know that's true. We know that it's like sort of killing the sheep instead of shearing the wool. That, hey, guys, the sheep are all dead now. And now what are you going to do? The land goes fallow and lays there with no sheep on it. If you shear the wool, it'll be forever. That same idea of farming the forest, We aren't. We're just cut the forest and let them grow up. And we aren't cutting forests that are easy to grow up. We're cutting lands that are so steep and so rocky that the soils will take generations, hundreds of centuries to to be viable again. In the meantime, you're going to have poor forests. In some cases, in the interior here, we have bacterias that develop on clear-cut forest that wouldn't create otherwise. And that what they do is that they will, when the stumps are there, these bacteria develop on the rotting stump. So it's a dead growth, and it's a bacteria that works on dead growth, but it will attack live growth if it gets, it's like all of us, we carry bacteria that could kill us, but only if they could multiply in numbers. Our body keeps that from happening. So there's sort of an endemic and epidemic level of things happening. And this is the kind of understanding that people have to bring. And if they don't understand that as a scientist, and they go in to meet with somebody and they end up with somebody who explains this, when you say you can't do this, and he says, but if we did what you would do, this would happen. And the person's, all of his arguments are gone. He has to be able to handle all levels. Or maybe it's going to be teams of people that can handle all levels. I'm not quite sure. But they're going to have a strong leader. I sound like some Billy Graham, don't I?
No, there's a lot of missionizing.
Yes. But you asked where it's going to go. It has to go there. Everything else is just decoration. I mean, as much as I love the parks I'm designing for Concord and the values I'm creating in a better city, and when I'm through, it will be one of the most beautiful cities in Canada when I'm through. I'm helping to reinforce what is already happening with people who previous to me saved Stanley Park, and people after that who in my own lifetime have created English Bay that was all private housing, and who have gone on with a park board that now's philosophy is acquiring the land is more important than developing it. So let's acquire parkland now while we still can, even though it costs millions of dollars, rather than spend all of our budget on creating playfields. We can do that in the next generation because the land will be there for them. So it's those kind of philosophies, and I've tried to reinforce that with my work with Concord of saying this is the priority, and we'll pick the best land for parks, because those houses eventually, those billion-dollar buildings they're building at Concord for housing are going to be torn down someday. That blows my mind that these are billion-dollar edifices that'll cost multi-billion dollars to tear down and rebuild. But one day those will come down and something else will be built. But the parks will stay. I mean, Central Park will always be a park and will stay there forever. And it'll be more sacred all the time. So that's the kind of thing I'm involved in. And I get quite excited about that. But it's an urban issue. It's not an environmental issue. It's, as I say, it's almost decoration. It's a better life for those who live in the city. But it isn't where the big issue is. So everybody will go different ways, I guess. We'll become more multidisciplinary. Maybe landscape architecture is a funny term. Architects became more specialized. They, what? Exactly. Well, but then the hospital architect doesn't design it. He coordinates a design team that has to do with everything from mechanical engineers to elevator designers to facade designers to lighting level, acoustical. These are all specialists that are specialists within the specialists. And they love being more specialized. The architects are not trying to generalize. And the landscape architects are right now so generalized, and talk to Maura and people like that. They don't know where they're going. It's just too boggling the mind. I'm saying yes, and it is. It does boggle the mind, but we got to come to grips with that and say, that is who we are. That isn't, we don't know who we are, we're going 7 directions. No, we are people who are not going 7 directions, but it's bringing 7 directions to a center. That we are at the ends of it, pulling it in rather than running off. Right now, we're just running off. That guy decides, well, I'm going to school, I'm going to do environmental work. And he goes through the program, and he goes off. And he doesn't see that coming back to somebody who alongside him was dealing with, I ran into an architect that was one of my students at Hong Kong the other night, and he's now doing an environmental sewage treatment plant, which is what I think we're hearing one of the speakers this afternoon speaking on, where that the marshes and things become the natural system for a new sewage treatment plant. And it's sort of, if you understand the environmental balances, the way it works. And I'm saying, yes, and that's another guy you grab, and you bring him into the system, and you grab these people and bring them together. But I don't think anybody's capable of doing that but a landscape architect. That may sound arrogant, but I think the students would say yes. That the people my age would say, oh, no, we'll never do that. But,
People your age, that's just what they're saying.
oh, they are.
People even older.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe we've seen where we've come and said we've come a long way, and therefore we believe we can go a long way further. Yeah. What are the young people saying? You don't know. You've been talking to all the old people. So you're hearing an echo when you hear me say these things, I guess.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That's definitely the philosophy of many people, is that landscape architects have the ability and have the training to be the ones to pull disparate parts together.
But each one of these people probably felt they weren't the one, because they hadn't had the background that it needed to pull it together, I think.
Well,
maybe not.
They're kind of saying landscape architects out there in space, and I don't know if they're actually including themselves or not. But a lot of people are saying, too, in that same vein, that landscape architects need to be the ones who are affecting policy, that landscape architects can't continually go along and be reactive. They've got to be proactive in terms of setting policy, being the people who are, not an engineer setting policy, not an architect setting policy, but a landscape architect setting it, and then kind of shifting the whole emphasis. So instead of landscape architects being the ones who pull this all together, maybe there won't be a need for that. Maybe they can be the person who are the people who are actually setting the programs for everybody else.
Yeah.
So perhaps there are. There are lots of ways of looking at
Well,
this.
Michael Huff's doing probably was capable a job as one can in setting policies in this way of environmental sensitivity to recharging the groundwater and things like that.
Well, I think we'll sort of
call it a wrap.
Yeah. For now,
Okay. The only question you didn't ask was about what I thought about Canadian-American differences.
Go ahead.
And I'll be very brief. As I was saying to you, that I found these questions you had listed of ones about this differences is very puzzling, because I thought I have nothing to say because I don't agree that there is a difference. And you're saying, well, that's an opinion. That isn't just the fact you don't have an opinion. It is one, because again, as I was saying, that we're linear in our continent. Yeah, and we're West Coast, and that's doesn't matter whether it's San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, or Vancouver, that we relate that way economically, socially, politically, and the same with the prairies, and geographically, and the same with the rest. And therefore, the University of Washington, University of Oregon, California, that's where Maura went, is where we communicate back and forth with. And I think that there's a political difference, and that's more about health care and priorities, and more of the philosophical differences that are Canadian. But as a landscape architecture, I don't know that the prairie landscape isn't as valid in the States as it is prairie in they call it the Midwest down there, and they call it the prairies here, but it's the same landscape. And our sensitivity to sort of a natural environment here is the same plants, the same attitudes. Some of the best work that has been done on the Oregon coast in that sensitivity, with the new aquarium in Newport and Salishan and projects like that really are doing the same thing we're trying to do, and they're ideals that we borrow from rather than us looking to Ottawa for ideas. So I think that our programs and our concerns are going to be our forests, our fisheries, our water, and therefore we're going to bind ourselves stronger. And I think that's a healthy thing. I think it's like there's a lot of debate about the free trade, but free trade is a healthy thing. It's saying we can't bolster up the weak. We have to be capable of self-sustaining and being strong. And if systems are always keeping the weak alive, the weak will only get strong, more prevalent. And it's got to be dealt with as like free trade. This continent is a singular item, and the boundary is really irrelevant, other than a sort of social political thing I think we can individually hang on to. Sort of we're multicultural here in Canada, like nowhere else in the world. How do we think that we can't incorporate the United? Why are we afraid of them? They are such a minority of influence compared to the fact we have German and Chinese and Arabian and Pakistani influences that are so strong on our systems, our education systems, our social systems, our medical systems, our religious awareness. What do the Americans scare us about? I mean, why we can incorporate them as part of us and us as part of them, and that would be a healthy thing. But there is almost a paranoia fear that we're going to lose our identity, and we haven't yet, and we've incorporated every culture in the world. Anyway, so now we can quit.
Interesting to hear you say we. I wonder if because of your own background, because of your education, where you were educated in the United States, I wonder if there hasn't been I don't know how to actually phrase this question. The thoughts that are going through my mind are, if you had been trained at UBC versus the University of Oregon, I wonder if you would be the same person.
No, you're absolutely right. I was trained in the States. I went in the service. I traveled in the Orient. I've taught in programs that UBC sets into other countries for the very reason that if you learn something somewhere else, you'll learn it differently. And therefore, I see it in a different perspective. And I know Arthur Erickson once, 15, 20 years ago, said the only thing wrong with the Vancouver architects is that they don't know there's anywhere else in the world. And so what they get sort of funneled into them rather than go out and personally experience it. And I think that's the case, that maybe I say what I say, partly because I was educated somewhere else and see things differently because I'm here as a visitor, so to speak. And I think that this is why our studies of program abroad was interesting, because we took students into areas and they saw the people there different than the people did because it was different. And when they came back after having to try and solve a problem, we went into Shakiwan, which is the squatters village on the hillsides of Hong Kong, met with the people and spent several days with them in their shacks and homes and meeting rooms and dealing with their connected hoses for water systems and plugged in extension cords going from house to house as an electrical system, and try to deal with designing for them. The students realized that it was basic needs. That one student's solution would, what could you do as an architect to make it better for them? He created a trolley system so they didn't need to carry everything up their back. In other words, he began to see that these were the solutions to that community. When he came back to Canada to design again, he saw problems totally differently because he'd been away and saw that. And I think, yes, if I grew up in BC, went to UBC, I'd be quite protective and complacent about the fact this is the way it is, and why are we involving ourselves with somebody else? I think it's just like the computers, though. I think that to pretend that we're going to be isolated is bizarre. It's a world that's so communicating with every other part of the world in such a way that, you know, Clinton's involved in trying to settle problems in the Middle East. And granted, he doesn't know much about what he's talking about, but we aren't, you know, we need a problem in the Middle East when some, you know, be it whether he was an American or not, goes in and shoots up in a mosque a bunch of people worshiping, becomes a world problem. And we are now the fact that these problems are world problems, and our forests and what we're doing here on the West Coast is a world problem. And everybody from Germany to South America knows that we have this problem and are concerned and are acting and reacting because of it. It's hard to say, well, we should have a Canadianism. We should be proud to be Canadians, and we should try to maintain the values that we have as a Canadian. But those are personal values. I don't know that if you tried to explain that to someone that has arrived here as an immigrant from another country, he would understand that he came here for economically and political reasons. And the fact that you're concerned that we are peacemakers, he thinks is very nice, but that's not his priority. That's our priority. And the fact that we spend money that we don't have, making the world better with foreign aid programs to some countries like Germany, is the most bizarre thing they've ever heard of. But that is our attitude, and that's fine. We can maintain that and still not have to worry that are our schools Canadian enough. And might waste our energy. Anyway, that was the only other thing that was on that list, wasn't it?
Yeah.